Let me take you back to where it all began. Picture this, a small town market, the kind where everyone knows everyone, where the smell of fresh bread mingles with the fragrance of wildflowers, and where hope can live for 30 long years. My name is Evelyn Carter, and this is the story of the longest wait of my life, a wait that would test every fiber of my being, challenge my faith in humanity, and ultimately teach me the most profound lesson about love, forgiveness, and the power of never giving up. It all started with a ritual that would define 3 decades of my existence. Every Friday morning, without fail, I would wake up at exactly 6:30 a.m. The alarm was unnecessary. My body had memorized this routine so deeply that I could feel Friday approaching in my bones. I would put on the same blue cardigan, the one with the small hole near the left elbow that I refused to mend because it reminded me of better times. I would take the same worn-out shopping bag, its handles softened by countless grips of hope and desperation. Then, I would walk 3 blocks to the Old Town Market. But here's where most people got it wrong. They thought I went there to shop. They thought I was just another elderly woman going through the motions of domestic life. How wrong they were. How heartbreakingly, devastatingly wrong. I went there to wait. Every Friday, I would position myself on the same weathered wooden bench just outside Martha's florist stall. The bench had become my altar of hope, my throne of endless vigil. From that spot, I could see every entrance to the market square. I could watch every face that passed by, searching for the one face that had haunted my dreams for 30 years. The vendors knew me well. Martha, the florist, would nod politely each week. Sometimes she would offer me a daisy free of charge, her eyes filled with a pity that I both appreciated and resented. Giuseppe, the fruit vendor, would hold up particularly beautiful pears, knowing that sometimes, just sometimes, I might buy one. Not because I was hungry, but because the act of purchasing something made my presence seem less pathetic, less desperate. But mostly I just sat there, watching, waiting, hoping. People whispered about me, of course. In a small town, whispers travel faster than the morning fog. Some said I was lonely, that the market had become my social outlet. Others believed I simply enjoyed the bustling atmosphere, colors, the sounds, the life that pulsed through the square every Friday. They were all wrong. The truth was hidden in the quiet sadness that had taken permanent residence in my eyes. The truth was folded carefully in my coat pocket, a small piece of paper that had become more precious to me than any treasure on earth. It was a grocery list. But this was not an ordinary grocery list. While other people wrote down milk, bread, eggs, and vegetables, my list contained only one word. One single, powerful, earth-shattering word that had become my obsession, my quest, my reason for existing: forgiveness. To understand why this word meant everything to me, I need to take you back 30 years, back to when my world collapsed in a single moment, when words spoken in anger became weapons that destroyed the most important relationship in my life. I had a son named Thomas. Oh, how that name still makes my heart flutter and break simultaneously. Thomas was not just my child. He was my miracle, my joy, my entire universe compressed into one beautiful, complicated human being. He was clever in ways that sometimes frightened me. His mind worked differently from other children. Where they saw simple objects, he saw possibilities. Where they accepted explanations, he asked deeper questions. He was also restless. Restless in the way that brilliant souls often are when they feel trapped by circumstances, by expectations, by the limitations of small-town life. I could see it in his eyes from the time he was 15, that hunger for something bigger, something more meaningful than what our little town could offer. By the time he turned 18, that restlessness had transformed into something more dangerous: rebellion. The argument happened on a Tuesday evening in March. I remember the date because it was exactly 1 week before his 19th birthday. I had been planning a small celebration, had even bought ingredients for his favorite chocolate cake. The irony of that detail still cuts through me like a knife. The fight started over something so trivial that I can barely remember what triggered it. I think it was about his plans after high school. I wanted him to consider the local community college. He wanted to leave town immediately, to chase dreams that seemed impossible and dangerous to my protective mother's heart. But the argument quickly escalated beyond career choices. 30 years of accumulated frustrations, misunderstandings, and unspoken tensions exploded in our small living room like a bomb that had been waiting to detonate. "You do not understand anything about what I want," he shouted, his face flushed with anger and tears. "You have never tried to understand. I understand that you are throwing away every opportunity one have worked to give you." I shot back, my own voice rising to match his intensity. "I understand that you are being selfish and ungrateful." The words that came next are burned into my memory with surgical precision. I can recall every syllable, every pause, every breath between the sentences that would haunt me for 3 decades. "You know what, Mom?" he said, his voice dropping to a whisper that was somehow more terrifying than his shouting. "You are right. I am selfish. I am selfish enough to want a life that is not controlled by your fear. I am selfish enough to want to make my own mistakes instead of living in your safe, suffocating little world." "If that is how you feel," I replied, my pride wounded and my heart breaking, "then maybe you should just leave. Maybe you should go find that perfect life you think is waiting for you out there." He stared at me for what felt like an eternity. I could see the exact moment when something died in his eyes, some essential connection between us that I had just severed with my thoughtless words. "Fine," he said quietly. "Maybe I will." He went to his room and packed a single bag. I stood in the hallway, listening to drawers opening and closing, hangers scraping against the closet rod, the sound of his life being compressed into portable pieces. Part of me wanted to knock on his door, to apologize, to take back the words that had already caused so much damage. But pride is a terrible thing. Pride makes cowards of the bravest people. Pride convinced me that he would cool down, that he would realize how foolish he was being, that he would come back before morning with an apology. I was catastrophically wrong. He came out of his room 20 minutes later, bag slung over his shoulder, eyes red but determined. He paused at the front door and looked back at me one final time. "I love you, Mom," he said, his voice barely audible, "but I cannot stay here anymore." "Thomas, wait," I started to say, but the door was already closing behind him. That was the last time I saw my son. No calls, no letters, no contact of any kind. Just silence that grew heavier and more suffocating with each passing day. The first week I was angry. Angry at his stubbornness. Angry at his ingratitude. Angry at the world for raising children who could walk away from their mothers so easily. I told myself he would be back within a month. Humbled by the harsh realities of independence, the first month became the first year. The first year became the first decade. And still, there was nothing but silence. During those early years, I tried everything. I hired private investigators who found nothing. I contacted police departments in major cities, hoping he had gotten into trouble that would at least confirm he was alive. I even reached out to his high school friends, begging them for any information about where he might have gone. Nothing. It was as if Thomas had simply vanished from the earth, leaving behind only the echo of our final argument and the growing weight of my regret. People told me move on. Well-meaning friends and relatives suggested that I accept the situation, that I focus on building a new life without him. They pointed out that he was an adult who had made his choice, that I could not spend my entire life waiting for someone who clearly did not want me found. They were wrong about that too, because regret, I learned, sits heavier on the chest than grief ever could. Grief is clean, final, manageable. You mourn, you heal, you move forward. But regret is a living thing that feeds on hope and possibility. Regret whispers constantly about what could have been, what should have been, what might still be if you just wait long enough. Thomas was not dead. He was just away, somewhere, and that knowledge became both my salvation and my torture. 5 years after he left, something changed in my approach to this endless waiting. Instead of actively searching, instead of chasing leads and hiring investigators, I decided to make myself findable. I decided to create a pattern so consistent, so reliable, that if he ever decided to come back, he would know exactly where to find me. The old town market had been Thomas's favorite place as a child. Every Saturday morning, I used to take him there to buy fresh produce and flowers. He loved the energy, colors, the way Giuseppe would sneak him extra grapes when he thought I was not looking. He especially loved the corner where Martha sold her flowers, because she let him help arrange bouquets and taught him the names of different blooms. If he ever came back to town, I reasoned, he might visit the market. He might look for familiar faces, familiar places that connected him to happier memories. So I began my vigil. Every Friday morning, I would walk those 3 blocks and take my position on the bench outside Martha's flower stall. I chose Friday instead of Saturday because I thought it would be less obvious, less desperate looking than returning to our exact old routine. At first, I actually did some shopping during these visits. I would buy vegetables, fruits, sometimes flowers for my empty house. But as the weeks turned into months, and the months turned into years, the pretense became harder to maintain. I found myself buying less and less, until sometimes I would purchase only a single pear or 1 egg, just enough to justify my presence. The vendors began to understand. They never asked questions, never made me feel unwelcome, but I could see the pity in their eyes. Martha started giving me flowers for free, claiming they were damaged or unsold from previous days. Giuseppe would offer me the best fruit at discounted prices, sometimes refusing payment altogether. Their kindness was both touching and humiliating. As the years passed, the market changed around me. Young vendors became middle-aged. Middle-aged vendors retired and were replaced by their children or sold their stalls to strangers. New buildings rose around the square. The old bakery was torn down and replaced with a modern coffee shop. The hardware store became a boutique selling expensive clothing that no one in our town could afford. But I remained constant. Every Friday, same bench, same blue cardigan, same worn-out shopping bag, same piece of paper in my pocket with that single word written in fading ink: forgiveness. People stopped trying to convince me to give up hope. After the first decade, even my closest friends accepted that this was simply who I had become, the woman who waited at the market. Some newcomers to town thought I was a fixture, like the old fountain or the statue of the town's founder. Children would point at me and ask their parents who I was, and the parents would shush them and hurry past. I became a local legend, cautionary tale, a symbol of stubborn hope that some found inspiring and others found tragic. But I did not care about their opinions. I cared only about the possibility that this particular Friday, might be the one when everything changed. By the 20th year, something shifted inside me. The acute pain of loss had transformed into something more manageable, but more profound. A deep, abiding sadness that colored everything I saw and felt. I stopped expecting Thomas to appear. I stopped scanning every face with desperate intensity. Instead, I simply existed in a state of patient readiness. I still hoped, but it was a quieter hope now, like a candle that burned steadily in a window, not because someone is definitely coming home, but because the light itself has become a form of prayer. During these middle years, I began to understand things about myself and about love that I had never realized before. I understood that my vigil was not really about Thomas anymore. It was about the mother I had failed to be during our final argument. It was about proving to myself that I was capable of the kind of unconditional love that I should have shown him when he needed it most. Every Friday on that bench, I practiced being the mother I wished I had been, patient instead of controlling, understanding instead of judgmental, present instead of demanding. It was the most expensive education of my life. The 25th year brought new challenges. My health began to decline. Arthritis made the walk to the market more difficult. My vision became less sharp, making it harder to distinguish faces in the crowd. Some Fridays, I wondered if Thomas could walk right past me, and I might not recognize him. But I adapted. I started arriving earlier and staying later. I moved closer to the main walkway, so that anyone entering the square would have to pass directly in front of me. I began wearing my old reading glasses, the ones Thomas used to tease me about. saying they made me look like a scholarly owl. The thought of missing him because of my failing eyesight terrified me more than the possibility that he might never come at all. As I entered my 30th year of waiting, something unexpected happened. I began to find peace with my routine. The weekly pilgrimage to the market had become more than a search. It had become a meditation, a form of worship, a way of staying connected to the deepest love I had ever known. Other aspects of my life had fallen away. I had retired from my job at the library. I had stopped maintaining friendships that required too much energy. I had simplified my existence down to its essential elements: waiting, hoping, and loving a son who might never return. Some would call this a wasted life. I began to see it as a purified one. Then came that gray autumn morning that would change everything. It was a Friday in late October. The leaves were turning brilliant shades of gold and crimson, falling from the trees like confetti celebrating some cosmic joke. The air was crisp but not yet cold, carrying the scent of wood smoke and the promise of winter. I had taken my usual position on the bench at exactly 8:30 a.m. Martha was arranging her flowers, creating small bouquets of chrysanthemums and late-blooming roses. Giuseppe was polishing apples until they gleamed like jewels in the morning light. The market was beginning to fill with its usual Friday crowd: mothers with young children, elderly couples checking items off carefully written lists, teenagers skipping school and trying to look invisible. I was not paying particular attention to any individual face. After 30 years, the intense scrutiny had become more of a gentle awareness, like peripheral vision that encompasses everything without focusing on anything specific. But then something made me look up. Maybe it was instinct. Maybe it was the way the light caught someone's profile. Maybe it was simply that after 3 decades of waiting, my heart had developed radar for the impossible. A middle-aged man in a brown coat was walking across the square, moving slowly, hesitantly, like someone who was not sure he belonged there. He was thinner than I remembered, with gray streaks threading through his beard. His hair, once thick and unruly, had receded and was now carefully combed in a way that suggested he cared about appearances in a way he never had as a young man. But his eyes, his eyes were exactly the same. He was carrying a paper bag in his hand, and there was something in his posture that spoke of guilt, of uncertainty, of a courage that had taken 30 years to build. He stopped about 10 feet away from my bench. Our eyes met, and in that moment, the entire world stopped spinning. Time became elastic, stretching this single instant into an eternity where everything that had happened over the past 30 years compressed into a single point of recognition and reunion. He looked older, of course, but then so did I. We were both different people than we had been during that terrible argument 3 decades ago. Life had carved lines into our faces, had bent our backs slightly, had taught us lessons that only time and experience can provide. But underneath all those changes, we were still mother and son, still the 2 people who had loved each other completely before pride and fear had driven us apart. He took a tentative step forward, then stopped again, as if he was not sure he had the right to approach me. "I was not sure you would still be here," he said, his voice trembling with emotion. Those words hit me like lightning. They confirmed what I had always hoped but never dared to believe, that he had known about my vigil, that somehow, somewhere, he had heard about the woman who waited at the market every Friday, that he had come here not by accident, but with intention. I looked up at him, the stranger who was my son, this son who had become a stranger, and I felt something shift inside my chest, something that had been clenched tight for 30 years, finally relaxed. I smiled, not with surprise, because in some deep part of my soul, I had always known this moment would come. I smiled with the softness that comes from years of silent hope finally being rewarded. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out the piece of paper that had been my companion for 3 decades, the grocery list with one word on it, the word that had defined my entire adult life. "Still working on my shopping," I whispered, holding up the paper so he could see it. He stepped closer and read the single word written there: forgiveness. His face crumpled, and I could see that 18-year-old boy again, the one who had been too proud and too scared to apologize, the one who had spent 30 years learning how to come home. But I finally got what I came for, I continued, standing up from the bench that had been my second home for so long. I opened my arms, and without hesitation, without fear, without any of the uncertainty that had kept us apart for 3 decades, he stepped into them, right there, between Martha's flower stall and Giuseppe's fruit cart, surrounded by the ordinary magic of market day. We held each other with the desperate intensity of 2 people who had almost lost everything that mattered. I felt his shoulders shake as 30 years of regret and longing poured out of him. I felt my own tears mixing with his as I held him tighter than I had ever held anything in my life. And in that moment, I took out my pen and crossed off the only thing that had ever really mattered. The word forgiveness disappeared under a firm, decisive line. Not because I was forgiving him. I had done that years ago, sitting on this very bench, understanding finally that anger was a luxury I could not afford if I wanted to keep loving him, but because we were forgiving each other, forgiving the 18-year-old boy who had been too proud to stay, forgiving the mother who had been too afraid to let him go, forgiving 30 years of silence that had taught us both what love really means. As we stood there holding each other, I became aware of the life continuing around us. Martha had stopped arranging flowers and was watching with tears in her eyes. Giuseppe was pretending to organize his fruit display, but I could see him wiping his face with his sleeve. Other shoppers had noticed our reunion, and some had stopped to witness this moment of healing that had been 30 years in the making. But I did not care about the audience. I cared only about the weight of my son in my arms, the sound of his voice saying, "I am sorry, Mom. I am so sorry." And my own voice responding, "I am sorry too, my love. I am sorry too." We talked for hours that day, right there on the bench, with the market swirling around us. We began the slow process of rebuilding a relationship that had been shattered by pride and fear. He told me about his life, the cities he had lived in, the jobs he had worked, the woman he had married and divorced, the children he had raised who did not know they had a grandmother. He told me about the years of wanting to call, but not knowing what to say, about the times he had driven to the edge of town, but could not bring himself to go farther. He told me that he had been back to our town several times over the years, always on Fridays, always checking to see if I was still coming to the market. He had never approached me before because he was not sure I would want to see him, was not sure he deserved forgiveness, was not sure he was strong enough to handle rejection. I told him about my life too, the emptiness of the house without him, the way I had kept his room exactly as he had left it, the investigators I had hired, the nights I had spent wondering if he was safe and happy. I told him about the evolution of my grief, how it had transformed from anger to sadness to acceptance to a kind of patient love that asked for nothing but hoped for everything. As the sun began to set and the market vendors started packing up their stalls, we walked home together. 3 blocks that I had traveled alone for 30 years, now shared with the person I had been walking toward all along. The house felt different with him in it, smaller somehow, but also more complete. He marveled at how little had changed, how his room was still waiting for him, like a shrine to his teenage years. "You really never gave up," he said, standing in his old doorway, looking at the bed that was still made with the same sheets he had slept on as a boy. "Giving up was never an option," I replied. "You were my son before you were born, and you will be my son after I die. Nothing that happened in between could ever change that." We spent the evening talking, catching up on 3 decades of separation, but also planning for the future. He had driven here from his home 2 states away, not sure if he would stay for an hour or a day. Now we were talking about holidays, about visits, about the grandchildren I had never met who would soon learn that they had a grandmother who had been waiting to love them their entire lives. That night, as I lay in my bed listening to the sounds of someone else breathing in the room down the hall, I felt a completeness that I had not experienced since he left. Not happiness, exactly. We had too much healing ahead of us for simple happiness, but wholeness, the sense that a fundamental piece of my life had been restored. The next morning was Saturday. And for the first time in 30 years, I did not feel the urge to plan for Friday. My vigil was over. My wait was complete. But that does not mean the story ends there. Thomas stayed for a week, and during those 7 days, we began the delicate work of rebuilding our relationship. We talked about our fight, about the words we both regretted, about the years of silence that had punished us both far more than either of us deserved. We also talked about forgiveness, not as a single act, but as an ongoing choice. Forgiveness, we discovered, was not something you did once and then moved on from. It was something you practiced daily, hourly, moment by moment. When he finally had to return to his own life, we made plans, real plans, with dates and phone calls and visits. He would bring his children to meet me at Christmas. I would travel to see his home, to meet the life he had built without me. Most importantly, we promised to never let silence grow between us again. We promised that when we disagreed, and we would disagree, because that is what families do, we would fight with words that we could live with later. As I watched him drive away that second time, I felt no panic, no desperation, no urge to run after him. This departure was different from the first one. This one came with promises, with plans, with the understanding that love is stronger than pride. The following Friday, I did something I had not done in 30 years. I stayed home. I made myself breakfast, read a book, tended to my garden. It felt strange, almost guilty, to break a routine that had defined my entire adult life, but it also felt like freedom. The Friday after that, I did go to the market, but not to wait. I went to shop, to thank Martha and Giuseppe for their kindness over the years, to participate in the community that had surrounded my vigil with such patient compassion. Martha hugged me and said, "I always knew he would come back." Giuseppe gave me the biggest, most beautiful apple from his cart and said, "Some things are worth waiting for." Now, months later, as I tell you this story, I want you to understand what I learned during those 30 years of waiting. Love is not a feeling that you fall into and out of. Love is a choice that you make every day, sometimes every moment. It is the choice to keep your heart open even when it hurts. It is the choice to hope even when hope seems foolish. It is the choice to wait even when waiting seems impossible. The bench where I sat every Friday has a small plaque on it now. The town council put it there without asking me, and I discovered it one day when I went to visit my old waiting spot. It says, "In honor of love that never gives up." I think about that plaque sometimes, and about the story it represents. Not just my story, but the story of everyone who has ever loved someone enough to wait for them, to hope for them, to keep a light burning in the window of their heart. Because here's what I know now that I did not know when Thomas first walked out that door. The waiting was not wasted time. The waiting was love in action. Every Friday I spent on that bench was a prayer, promise, a declaration that some bonds cannot be broken by time or distance, or even our own worst mistakes. The word forgiveness may be crossed off my list now, but it is written permanently on my heart. And every day, in small ways and large ones, I continue to practice what I learned during those 30 years of Friday mornings. That love is patient. That hope is a choice. That forgiveness is a gift we give ourselves as much as others. And that sometimes, if we wait long enough and love hard enough, impossible things become possible. That gray autumn morning when Thomas returned, he was carrying a paper bag in his hand. I never asked what was in it, but I suspect I know. I suspect it contained his own list, his own single word that had taken him 30 years to act upon. Home, because that is what forgiveness does. It brings us home to each other. It brings us home to ourselves. It brings us home to the love that was always there, waiting patiently beneath the hurt and the pride and the fear. And now, every time I see a mother and son arguing, every time I witness a family torn apart by words spoken in anger, I want to tell them what I learned. The door is never closed forever. Love always leaves a way back. And sometimes, the longest journey home begins with a single word written on a piece of paper, carried in a pocket, close to a heart that refuses to give up hope.